Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to put together the roll hoop and tackle the dampers on the Tamiya Sand Scorcher. We're up to step 5, the roll bar. We'll need the rear cage, or guard as Tamiya call it, the aluminium roll bar, 4 MB3 joints, an antenna mount, an M3 washer, 2 M3 nylock nuts, an M3x6 cap head, and 2 M3x22 cap heads. To build, we put one of the joints on the end of the cage and locate the roll bar. Pay attention to which way around the roll bar goes, as at this stage you can happily build it either way around, but it will become a problem later. To fit the joint, we insert one of the long screws from the inside and use a nut on the outside. There's a hex hole for the nut to sit in, so we just need to do it up so it's nice and snug. The other side is of course the same. Once snug, the cage should feel pretty solid. At the back we can attach the antenna mount with the short screw and washer. We're not going to be using it for an actual antenna of course, but we might just use it for a flagpole, so it's still worth fitting. Step 6, the damper internals. We need 4 3x3 grub screws, 8 2mm E-clips, 4 red O-rings, 4 pistons, 8 cylinder spacers, 2 long and 2 short shafts, 4 cylinder ends, and 4 rather nice brass damper ends. A few odd names, but I think we can work with it. The assemblies are all the same, except we end up with 2 short ones and 2 long ones. What we do is start by clipping an E-clip onto the inner hole on a rod using some pliers. Then we pop on a piston and follow it with another E-clip in the outer hole. Next we build up what will become the bottom seal. First we slide on a cylinder spacer, then an O-ring and another spacer. Now for best results we're going to use some really thick silicone oil to lubricate the O-rings and spacers. It'll make sure it all moves nicely right away so we don't damage the O-ring. It's probably worth mentioning though, these dampers are rather well known for leaks and there's really not a whole lot you can do to make them keep the oil in. The old tip was to mount them upside down so the leaky bit is upwards. Now we might try that at some point, but for now we'll just follow the instructions. With it all gooped up, we can slide on the cylinder end thread first. Next is the damper end, which goes on the end of the shaft. There's a flat to line up with the threaded hole for the grub screw, and before we put it in, we'll use a little bit of thread lock. Just a little, then we nip up the grub, and we wipe off the excess. Do the same 3 more times, and we've got a set of shafts ready to install. Step 7, the oil. Now we don't need much for this one, just the 4 damper bodies and 8 rubber damper bushings. Now we're going to use the oil from the kit, but usually I'd recommend using a known oil as a starting point, but I'm fully expecting these to leak past the point it really matters after just a couple of runs. I know it's a bit defeatist, but that's kind of how it is. I'm going to fill the bodies up to just below where the thread starts. We'll find as we screw the shaft assembly in, we're going to get a bit of leakage around the edge as the spacers and O-ring displace the extra. We should end up with a smooth damper that'll spring back when squeezed. It springs back because as you press the shaft in, it's displacing oil that doesn't have anywhere to go. So it's in effect trying to expand the whole body, which of course it can't really do. You could fill the bodies up a little bit less, so there's a small pocket of air which can compress, but then you'd end up with a damper full of frothy oil, which again isn't really ideal. To be honest, if you want performance, look at changing to a good aftermarket set of dampers. Or if you're going for a shelf queen and indoor runabout, just use enough oil to keep things lubricated and no more. For their faults, they do look good with the aluminium and brass. Complete for remembering short shafts in short bodies and long shafts in long bodies. Next we have the bushings, which are really simple. They just get squeezed into the holes at either end of the dampers. They're a little bit fiddly, but once you work it out it's a nice quick job. With all the bushings in, they're ready to fit. Step 8, fitting the roll bar and rear dampers. We're going to need the dampers, or actually just the long pair, the gearbox, the roll bar assembly, 2 3x12 cap heads, 4 3x10 cap heads, 2 M3 nylocks, 2 M3 washers, and 4 3x6.5 metal spacers. The first thing to do this time is offer up the plastic bit of the rear cage to the lower bit of the gearbox. Then we hinge it over and notice the mounts at the bottom of the aluminium roll bar almost perfectly lined up with the universal joints coming out of the gearbox. Luckily, it's just a case of loosening the 2 screws on the joints and swapping it round. It only takes a couple of minutes, but if I was paying attention to the diagram, I'd have noticed when I was assembling it. Whoops. Anyway, with the cage in place, we can insert 2 of the short screws through the bottom of the roll bar into the gearbox, but for now we'll just leave them slightly loose. Then looking at the bottom of the gearbox, we'll install 2 more of the short screws, this time with washers, again leaving them slightly loose. Once they're all in and the cage is nicely positioned, we can go around and nip up all 4 screws. Next up, the dampers. We need to insert a spacer in the 2 bushings and offer the top of the damper up to the thread that sticks out from the bar joint. Then to attach it, we thread on a nylock nut. It doesn't need to be super tight, just snug up to the bushing. At the bottom, we use the long screws to attach the bottom of the damper to the suspension arm. Nip it up, repeat on the other side, and that's the gearbox and the rear suspension ready to fit to the chassis. Step 9. Fitting the gearbox to the chassis. We need 1 M3x18 countersunk, 2 M3x10 countersunk, 3 rosette washers, which is quite a funky name. Basically they're just countersunk washers, a well nut, which is a rubber widget with a nut embedded in it, and there's 2 of the silicone covers that go on the bullet connectors. And lastly, we have the 2 chassis parts, one that's most likely fiberglass and an aluminium stiffener. First, we'll deal with the extra connector covers. They're supposed to go down onto the motor cover to seal up the holes. Tamiya want us to cut them down one side so we can pass them over the wires and stuff them in. But we've already got a pair on the connectors, so why don't we just push them down the wires and stuff them in the holes? Then we can push the new ones over the connectors. Works a treat and no split covers. I think it's probably quicker to do too. With that out of the way, we can mount the gearbox to the chassis. We need to match up the 2 panels with the diagram so we have everything at the right end. It's pretty obvious really, but still make sure it's right. Next, on the bottom of the gearbox, we'll stir in a little bit of thread lock in the outer holes. Offer up the chassis panels and thread in the 2 short screws with the funky washers. We'll only lightly tighten them now so we can still centre the chassis up on the gearbox. In the middle we have a long screw with another funky washer, but this time we use the well nut with the flange downwards. Now we don't need any thread lock for this one, plus we don't want to tighten it much at all. It's designed so when we do tighten it, the well nut expands. Later in the build, the well nut goes up in a hole in the electronics tray, and by expanding it, it grips the tray, fixing it to the chassis. Okay, now we can centre up the plates on the gearbox and nip up the 2 outer screws. Right, that's it for this week, and that's also it for the rear end. So next time we're going to get working on the front suspension. Right, as always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys.